want to, before we start with our readings, just say another few words of thanks to the entire Singapore Literature Festival team, to everyone at People's Forum, volunteers, staff, everyone. Yes, please. Round of applause. As G mentioned, I work at the Asian American Writers Workshop. I coordinate our public programs there, and I know that it takes a lot of beautiful but hard work to make something like this happen, to bring it all to life. So I wanted to thank and acknowledge that and give a special and specific shout out to G, who in my mind is nothing short of a superhero, seems to do everything imaginable, and is the true heart, I think, of this festival. So thank you. I've said this over email, in person briefly, but I am just so grateful to be on this panel with these women, these incredible works. It's been a real honor, very special to engage with and get to know you through your words on the page. But I've also been thinking about what an honor it is to get to meet the women, the constellations, the archipelagos of women in your lives and your histories who have sacrificed and survived and thrived so that we could all be here today. And I'm really excited for all of you to meet these women as well. Please purchase their books at the end of this event. They are revelatory. They're incredibly beautiful. We're going to start with readings. Gauitra will read first, and I will introduce her briefly. Gauitra Bahadur is a writer, critic, and journalist based in Jersey City, New Jersey. Her book, Coolie Woman, A Personal History of Indian Indenture in the Caribbean, was shortlisted for Britain's Orwell Prize for Artful Political Writing in 2014. An associate professor of arts, culture, and media at Rutgers Newark and a former newspaper reporter, she writes for the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, The Nation, and Dissent, among other publications. Her work has been recognized with literary residencies at MacDowell and Italy's Bellagio Center, and fellowships from Harvard, the British Library, and the New York Public Library. Gaiutra, please.
Thanks, Lily. Can you guys hear me through the mask? I apologize, I'm feeling a little unwell, so I just wanted to, out of an abundance of caution, do this for you guys. Thank you so much for having me here. I just got here from Guyana, where I'm on sabbatical this semester, so I've been in the homeland for 3 months, and it's always a complicated space, and raises questions about what's home and what's not, right? Because I was so happy when the plane landed at JFK. I was like, yay, I'm home. And I'm sure when I do the opposite, I'll say the same thing, right? So I'm going to read, actually not from Coolie Woman, but from an essay entitled Of Islands and Other Mothers. And this ran in an anthology of writing about New York City, Nonstop Metropolis. This is Rebecca Solnit's Atlas of New York City. And she and the other editors asked me to sort of consider New York as part of the Caribbean archipelago. Right, so that's sort of, I thought it just fit very neatly with the theme. So I'm going to read bits and pieces of this essay for about 10 minutes. Okay, so when Derek Walcott accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in '92, he described the Antilles as our archipelago becoming a synonym for pieces broken off from the original continent. This was no lament, but a shout of joy for our parallel attempts to reassemble the shards of language, of religion, of epic from separate homelands in Africa and Asia. What others mourned as mere parody, Walcott celebrated as poignant gestures toward reconstituted identity. His hope was that the descendants of the enslaved and the indentured might see how our fragments actually form a chain that connects us. We are all heir to rupture from whichever continent. The image of my mother praying dominates my memories of our first years in America. With a white lace orni covering her head, eyes shut, she stood in front of a closeted altar singing devotee songs with an intensity that made me quiet. Any reader of Jamaica Kincaid will know this terrain, this point at which mother and motherland meet, a juncture charged with too much love, too many expectations, and subtle accusations of abandonment Both mother and motherland give you a hard time for leaving. Neither quite lets go of you. In the hidden Caribbean, the worship of mother is everywhere. Indians brought their faith in the goddess Kali to the Caribbean and also transformed it. At the Sri Mahakali Devi Mandir in Brooklyn, worshippers call her Kali Mai, or simply Mother. On a recent visit there, I met a Guyanese American woman chosen to speak for the goddess. Tisha Morrison's very body, hazel eyes, hair marked as African, skin the same color as mine, joined the fragments from Asia and Africa that Walcott invoked. When she and her mother fell on hard times about 5 years ago, Tisha started to receive visions. Once, while brushing her teeth, the pungent smell of fish and the sea filled her bedroom. A lady wearing white suddenly floated past. Panicked and bewildered, Tisha Googled fish-smelling lady in white. The search engine deciphered the vision. It was Kali's sister, an incarnation of the Ganges River. The mother, Tisha said, was telling her she needed to come home. More Googling ultimately led to the Sri Mahakali Devi Mandir, where women are allowed to be priests. Tisha told me that envisioning the divine as maternal is a way of acknowledging her own mother, who brought her out of Guyana to deliver her from violence. When the pair emigrated, they were fleeing her father, a boxer with political connections who physically abused her mother. Everyone's mother is part of Mother Kali because mother has that unconditional love, Tisha explained. When you want to give up, you just look at her and you feel defended in the physical and the spiritual and protected. Some worshippers at the Kali temple also follow spiritual baptism, which allows for spirit possession too. In spiritual baptism, the Orishas, who act through healers and mediums, are from West Africa, but its rites are inflected with Hindu fragments, since it developed in a corner of Trinidad with a large Indian population. Spiritual Baptist churches are scattered all across Brooklyn, in storefronts, or in the case of St. John's Spiritual Baptist Church, in the basement of a Flatbush apartment building. With its brick back facing the street, St. John's barred windows are painted over like ever-lidded eyes. Its recessed doorway retreats behind a metal gate. At an adult baptism I attended there, feet stamped and hips moved for many hours. Congregants cried out and danced as if entranced, the way they had at the Kali temple. And their ceremonies were just as intense with incense and drumming, and just as taboo. On the day of the baptism I witnessed, the abbess who heads St. John sat enthroned, wearing sunglasses near an altar. Occasionally she tended it, rearranging ritual objects I know as Hindu. She was dressed the way all the female parishioners were, in a long skirt with an apron, a belt around her waist, her head wrapped in a kerchief. Other mothering, as the spiritual Baptists call it, beckons all mothers except biological ones, grandmothers, godmothers. For the many Caribbean women who have migrated to New York as domestic workers, the role of other mother mirrors how they make their living, taking care of other people's children, while in some cases leaving their own behind. Those far from their families sometimes need to be mothered too. During the baptism ceremony, I witnessed elder women in the church standing behind younger candidates for the faith, adjusting their white robes from time to time, setting a lazy foot straight, fixing a posture, or whispering encouragement or rebuke into their ears. Mother is an actual title in the spiritual Baptist hierarchy, earned through devotion. It was mid-September of 2015 when a spiritual Baptist I had met at another Flatbush church returned my call. Mother Myrtle declined my invitation to lunch, a little gruffly, explaining that every year around September 11th, she would lose her temper at the slightest provocation, and even her own family left her alone. 14 years after the attacks, this time of year still found her a recluse. I apologized for disturbing her. The 68-year-old great-grandmother repeated that she did not want to talk. I told her that I respected that and prepared to say goodbye. But she didn't hang up. Instead, for the next 90 minutes, she talked and I listened, in silent awe at the size of her grief. I held the phone to my ear gingerly, poised on the edge with her as she told me, with careening momentum, about her daughter, Siobhan. Siobhan, who was left behind in Guyana when Myrtle came to America. Siobhan, who had nonetheless managed, running a grocery and taxi service by herself at 17. Siobhan, who ultimately made her way to New York, too. Siobhan, who studied evenings at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Siobhan, who left her job in the World Trade Center, who was at her job in the World Trade Center when the planes hit on September 11th, 2001. That morning, mother and daughter had ridden the subway to work together. 3 times, Myrtle heard a voice say, "Admire your daughter." At first, Myrtle thought it was the person sitting next to her. From girlhood, she had had visions, and spirits spoke to her. But there, in that everyday commuter crush to Manhattan, she thought the source of the command more earthbound. When she realized it wasn't, she was confused. Why should she admire Siobhan? She saw her every day. The 3rd time the spirit spoke, it was roughly, admonishingly. So Myrtle obeyed. She registered every detail of her daughter: neat office clothes, hair pulled back tight, glasses on her nose, reading her daily word prayer book. Mother Myrtle tapped Siobhan on the knee, smiled goodbye, and got off to change trains. An hour later at Beth Israel Hospital, where she worked as a nurse's aide, she fainted when she saw the towers collapse on television. 1/5 of the casualties were foreign-born, and Guyanese suffered one of the highest losses. Siobhan was among them. For Mother Myrtle, the months that followed were a blur of her own near madness. She stopped eating and had to be put on an intravenous drip. Her hair went completely gray. She heard voices, which told her to strip and run down the street or jump out the window. She would wander in a trance and end up at the World Trade Center site and not know her way home. When ultimately she reclaimed her senses, it was through prayer and her church. "If I didn't know God," she told me, "I'd be one of the crazy ones." She has found her God at St. Gabriel's for almost 2 decades. The day I met Mother Myrtle, about 50 congregants were there, almost all of them middle-aged or elderly Black women from Guyana. I knew their accents. I could easily place their villages on a map. I was clearly an outsider, the only one there visibly Indian, but they acted like reproving mothers to me. Several shot me disapproving looks as my veil dropped. One in a gold pontiff's hat, a bishop in the church hierarchy, snapped at me for taking notes on my phone. Another reached back repeatedly to uncross my legs. "Why you lock yourself up so?" she asked. I had come before the Lord, and I needed to open to him. St. Gabriel's allows its followers to approach Jesus through different lineages. Mother Myrtle approached through Hinduism. And as our phone call ended, she grunted, then cried out, apparently as a medium for the mother, that is to say, Kali. The goddess had possessed her. Speaking in Guyanese Creole, she prophesied for me a Hindu wedding and a child in white. Still waiting for those. Then this matriarch from my home country told me that she also saw prayer ahead. I would not be the one to perform the ceremony. My mother would, she said. There seemed in all this a certain pattern. My mother would pray for me, as Myrtle still grieves in memory of Siobhan, as Tisha's mother had engineered her exodus to New York City. From one woman acting on behalf of a daughter to the next, had maternal fierceness somehow forged a chain to connect us across the divisive waters of race and religion and history? Was this then, at last, our Caribbean archipelago? Oh,
thank you so much. Thank you, Gaiutra. That's beautiful. Next, we're going to hear from Krystal. Krystal A. Sital is the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, Secrets We Kept, 3 Women of Trinidad, which was a finalist for the PEN America Emerging Writers Award. Her essays have been anthologized in A Map is Only One Story, 20 Writers on Immigration, Family, and the Meaning of Home, and Fury, Women's Lived Experiences in the Trump Era. Krystal's work has been featured in the New York Times, Elle, Huffington Post, Today's Parent, Salon, Catapult, Literary Hub, and elsewhere. And she currently teaches in the University of Tahoe's MFA program.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to start going back to in-person events. I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm obsessed with place and what place does to a person, how it changes, and how place becomes its own person, and it often becomes its own person in my work. So place is always a character, and it's something I'm struggling with now in the new book that I'm working on, because it kind of takes over sometimes, and it can't take, and I give in to that obsession, and now I'm at the point where, okay, I have to scale back. So I'm kind of looking back at what I did with place in this book, and the character I created, and then I go to the beginning and I realized the first sentence starts with place, and then all I do is talk about place for a while. So I wanted to share that with you, and also let you know that I'll read from the beginning, and then I'll read a truncated portion of the beginning, and then a little bit in another chapter. But writing this book also made me realize that all I want to do is write about women's issues and health. And so a lot of the articles that I publish have to do with women's health and women's issues, and through my own personal lens. And I think it was in writing this book that helped me forge that path for myself too. So this is the opening. It's called Trinity. We are of Trinidad, my grandmother, my mother, and I. Our island is located in the Lesser Antilles of Paradise, a dot on the map that is often forgotten. It's like a drop of oil, some say, as though somebody forget to wipe it away. The bodies of water that seep into the island are as much a part of the island's identity as they are a part of ours, and everywhere we have come to settle after abandoning home has been with the proximity of the seaside in mind. Perhaps the openness of the sea soothes the inner turmoil of us island women, or perhaps it shows the island's inability to contain us. While attending school in Trinidad, home, as we will call it, for the rest of our lives, though we are all now settled in America, we're taught how Christopher Columbus discovered it in 1498. That the Caribbean and Arawak tribes were indigenous didn't stop historians from calling it a discovery. In conversation with Americans, I've heard my grandmother and mother draw the same facts from our elementary education, the same ones I mentioned to others today. Do you know why it's called Trinidad? It's because of the three hills along the southern coast of the island, Mont Derrick, Rossmont, and Guaya Hill. When Columbus first spotted the land on July 31st in 1498, he was inspired to name it after the three hills, La Trinidad, the Trinity. These trinate hills that peak above the clouds in mottled greens, picturesque, majestic, form a wall that breaks the patterns of the most ferocious hurricanes, a natural protection that no other island in the Caribbean owns. The Trinity represents our most powerful guardians. On our islands, you will find descendants of Carib and Arawak tribes, Europeans, Venezuelans, Chinese, Syrians, French, Portuguese, and Lebanese, but of them all, the two largest groups by far are East Indians and Africans. Centuries before Trinidad became a British colony, before Sir Walter Raleigh discovered the natural pitch lake that gleamed the blackest blue along the spools of water on Trinidad's knee, before Columbus spotted the island, Amerindians called it home. They called it Irie, land of the hummingbird. But when Columbus sailed upon them, these people were captured, enslaved, and littered along the coasts of other Caribbean islands, forced to work for Spain. Our island changed hands, and when the British captured it from Spain, they brought African slaves to work the leafy grounds of the sugar plantations. This was the only group of people to exist on the island as slaves, and when slavery was abolished in England, the wealthy landowners in Trinidad then brought indentured laborers from India to replace the Africans on the plantations. Sorry, I'm not sick, I have asthma. At least we get pay, the Indians now say. Dem niggas and them come as slave. They know the history, but continue to etch in these lines, drawn for them. They perpetuate a war. The East Indians and Africans, one group thinking they're better than the other. East Indian children rhyming in the schoolyard. Nigga, nigga, come for roti, all the roti done. When the Indian raise a gun, all the nigga run. And Africans taunting. Inni, mini, miny, mo, catch a coolie by he toe. When he ready, let him go. Inni, mini, miny, mo. And so this enmity between Africans and Indians led them and others to maintain the perceived purity of their bloodlines, further carving hatred into our island's history. Interracial couples and their multiracial children are still shunned, as they were in my mother's childhood and my grandmother's. The blended are labeled mulatto, dogla, cocopayol. These words are hissed and spat at my family. My grandmother is mixed. My Indian grandfather is not. Our stories are rooted in the Caribbean, our histories woven into its bougainvillea trellises with their paper-thin petals, the lone road winding round and round the mountain like a serpent strangling a tree, coiling up and down again to the virgin beaches untouched by hotels and tourists, crowds and money. The foliage so dense and green it's a prismatic shade of malachite, almost as though the vegetation itself is choking the life out of the island. This is a place where the intoxicating aroma of curry drapes itself around you in layers, where bake and shark sandwiches are fried on the beach, where the main ingredient for every dish is the heady bandanya, our word for culantro. No, not cilantro. It is much stronger than that. Here, people devour every part of every animal from the eyeballs to the guts and lick their fingers and pat their bellies when they are through. The island can be traversed in a day, less than that if you know what you're doing. A mere 10 degrees north of the equator, it is a place of heat so intense it can drive a person insane. And yet, waves curling against the seashore deep in the valleys between the mountains, and the luminous rivers that seem to fall from the sky itself, can quench that same person's soul for eternity. Trinidad is our fears and our loves. There we discovered our beings. We dug deep and planted our roots, assuming we would never leave, sucking on the armored cascadura with its silver-plated shell, devouring the sweet flesh beneath the only fish, the legend says, ties you to the land forevermore, smacking our lips when we are done. We never thought we would have to leave this place, since our mothers and fathers planted our placentas beneath mango and plum, pomegranate and coconut trees. But in the end, we choose to flee. We leave. We do. With no intention of turning back, we embrace America for everything Trinidad was not. And then to give you an idea that there are characters in this book, other than plays, I'm going to read to you a little snippet of when I go to my grandmother, because what the catalyst for this story really is that my grandfather falls and he hits his head and he has 3 successive brain surgeries because of hemorrhagic bleeding, and they start to talk. Their stories start to come out because he's in this incapacitated state. She achieves every step of the cooking process with finesse, she being my mother. She twirls around the kitchen with a final sweep of her elegant arms, one we both laugh over. She signals to me that dinner is done. Fluffy rice, chunky saffron dal, and curry chicken. The sting of habanero saturates the air. My mother spoons a mountainous amount of food onto 2 plates. She sits across from me with a fork in hand and opens her mouth to call to my father and my sister, but I speak before she can. Ma, why grandma want grandpa dead? She drops her fork. It clatters to the ceramic countertop. Oh God, Chris. Them memories and them eating me up inside ever since he gone in that hospital. Me only waking up so in the middle of the night to see he 2-eye burning on me so like fire. She starts to tell me about a beating that has haunted her for 36 years. The ease with which she slides into the telling of this story shows me she was bursting to tell me as much as I wanted to ask. With my grandfather struck lifeless in the hospital, she's finally safe. Our steaming plates of food are pushed to the side. They grow cold. Runny dal pools in the middle of the rice. It clumps. The glistening curry chicken loses its shine. Veins in her neck pulsate as she speaks. Her eyes dance and dilate, nostrils flare, cheeks pucker, and palms slam the table. The fluorescent bulbs burning down on us seem to dim, and she glows amber in the darkness slithering around us. We start at the beginning. We go back to the haunting, to the cycle, to the deafening roar of silence from women echoing off the coasts of the islands. I learn that my mother and my grandmother do want to tell us. All we must do is ask, then listen. They reach deep into the gullet of Trinidad's history to extract stories women carry, stories men like my grandfather have striven to squelch. Their voices are thread thin and low, slow and rhythmic musical notes from the side pockets of a steel pan. Their words crescendo like the pulsation of island music. I close my eyes and listen to their textured words layered with Trinidadian Creole. They will spend a lifetime trying to escape the islands and these memories, to unclasp the shackles around each wrist. The cadence of their language is mature and differs from the shrill intonations of the children they once were. Their words are incantatory, a chant I cannot, will not forget. I feel it like blood pumping in my veins. These two women pour themselves into me, and for 4 years it is difficult to pull apart our separate lives. What I learn of our islands, our people, and their buried collective history torments me before it shifts to something else entirely. My family's history attacks me in waves as notorious as those that clobber the Caribbean shores. My grandmother, my mother, and I, we enter this world together, collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Yu-Mei. Yu-Mei Balasingamchow is the co-author of Singapore Biography and co-editor of In Transit, an anthology from Singapore on airports and air travel. Her short fiction has received a Pushcart Prize special mention, won the Mississippi Review Fiction Prize, and been shortlisted for the Sewanee Review Fiction Contest and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. She has an MFA in creative writing from Boston University and is writing a novel with the support of a 2022 grant from the Elizabeth George Foundation. Originally from Singapore, she now lives in Boston. Please, Yu-Mei.
Hello, this works? Yes, excellent. Okay, closer. Hi, thank you all for being here. Thank you for this chance to be on the panel, and thank you to my panelists. I really enjoyed your very beautiful and powerful readings, and thinking about stories about mothers in many parts of the world. I'm not going to read from Singapore Biography. I thought today I would offer some kind of reflections maybe on unraveling stories about South Asians in Singapore within the specific Singapore context. I'm going to run my timer because I'm afraid of talking for too long. Yeah, and I think the place I want to start, just kind of situating myself, is I do feel a sense of distance, I think, between myself and the subject of today's discussion. The book Singapore Biography is something I co-authored, and it was published in 2009, like more than 10 years ago. And it came out of work that I did for the National Museum of Singapore, doing research and storytelling for a very big exhibition that was up for about 10 years. So it feels very much, the book feels very much like a discrete object that I've kind of completed, set there. And in some ways it's a kind of line of inquiry that I'm not pursuing in the same way. I am much more of a fiction writer now. I've been writing short stories for about a decade. I'm working on a novel. They all have elements of Singapore in it, but coming at it from different angles. And then the other reason, I guess, I feel some distance from the subject of the panel, even though I'm interested in it, is that I myself am mixed race. And so I have Sri Lankan heritage, but also Southern Chinese heritage. And I think subconsciously, like reflecting on it now as an adult, I have always kind of identified as being between cultures, whether in Singapore or like now in the US where I happen to live. in the world. Like there are lots of mixed race people out there, but we also all have specific experiences depending on where you grew up, what your family dynamics were, and so on. So I feel I'm coming to the subject not so much from a personal or family connection. I haven't attempted a family memoir like my co-panelists, but I am a very curious observer of history. And I'm really interested also in how like narratives get shaped. And so specifically for today, like how stories about South Asian history in Singapore has emerged or been shaped by by social forces. And then maybe the point where I thought of a connection between my former work in history and my present work in fiction is that I think primarily I'm always interested in stories, which is why I say I'm not a very good historian, because I'm more interested in the stories and the choices that individuals have made in the middle of a historical situation rather than the history itself. And then thinking about, like, as a fiction writer right now, I am often thinking about what is said versus what is unsaid or not mentioned or omitted, and then what is stated and recorded versus what is overlooked, marginalized, erased. And then like the third sort of larger question of like what is unsayable, like what is the thing that the writer or the subject doesn't even realize that they could be speaking or gesturing towards, some kind of like invisible desire, for want of a better word. And today I thought I would use the figure of my paternal grandfather, who is my connection to South Asia, as a sort of like focal point for just looking at these ideas a little further. So my grandfather, what do I know of him? His name was Nelipile Tirunavak Arasu, and he came to Singapore from Sri Lanka just before World War II. At that time, Sri Lanka was known as Ceylon. In Singapore, he married my grandmother, who was an immigrant from China, and they had 6 children, one of whom was my dad. And my grandfather passed away when he was 8 years old. So I don't actually remember much about him. I was a very shy child, easily frightened, and he seemed very fierce and gruff. And I do not recall having a conversation with him, although I must have. He spoke Tamil, English, and Malay, which was kind of typical for someone of his generation. But it also doesn't seem that he said very much about his own life before he came to Singapore to my grandmother or to his children. In fact, the only thing we sort of know, maybe, is that he left Ceylon from the port of Jaffna, and that's about it. And so there are all these sort of, at the basic level, factual gaps in his life. And it's conceivable that we could track these things down, for instance, by going to Sri Lanka and knocking on doors and looking in records that exist and so on. And maybe, just maybe, it would be possible to piece together some kind of partial picture of his life based on what other people say, information that exists in records, and so on. But at the same time, I think, importantly, it is unlikely that we would have access to his emotional life. And so, for instance, we don't know why he didn't say more about his life in Ceylon, although we can speculate. And we will never really know how he felt about his life at all. And then thinking about this at a more sort of systemic level, I think the things I think about are like questions of like what's overlooked, marginalized, and so on because of the social position that my grandfather occupied. And so as far as we know, he came to Singapore because in Ceylon he had worked for the British. And so he comes to Singapore because he can get a job with the British again. He may have worked as a clerk at the British naval base in Sembawang, although I am not certain of that. But maybe the sort of thing that we know for sure is that him coming to Singapore was probably influenced by economic need and the British Empire, making some kind of connections at the time. And so to put it bluntly, my grandfather is not the sort of person that history conventionally cares about. He was not a great actor of history. He didn't make any remarkable achievements. He was one of many ordinary so-called small people who did what they needed to do to get by in life. And also it's interesting, just sort of like as a side note, from an anthropology class I remember taking, but that, also the kind of systems of power that exist today encourage people like my grandfather, people who are not great or famous, who do not occupy positions of social or political prestige. People like that are encouraged to think that their own stories are not important, don't need to tell them, and therefore they are less likely to tell their stories and pass them on. And so that's like one kind of gap. And then more specifically coming to Singapore and looking at how the history of South Asian people in Singapore has kind of emerged or developed. There's sort of two other points I want to raise. And one is that in the post-independence period, the period I grew up in, according to the government, the PAP-dominated independent government, there are 4 official races. And I use air quotes because we know the concept of race is a highly problematic social construct, but tell the government. But there are 4 official races, Chinese, empirically the largest, Malay, Indian, and others, capital O, others. This is not a joke. It really says that. And then there are 4 official languages, according to the state: English, Mandarin Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. And this setup is very problematic. I'm not going to get into that. But the point I want to make is that when it comes to the label Indian, which of course is highly inadequate, over the years it has become conflated with people who speak the Tamil language, even though many other South Asian Singaporeans speak other languages from the subcontinent. And also it gets conflated with people who are Hindu, even though, again, there are plenty of South Asians who are of other faiths. And so you end up with this state-driven, monolithic, essentialized understanding of race and culture that is everywhere, from, school textbooks to news reports to National Day. And yeah, what's lacking, which is, I find really a problem, is a lack of appreciating multiplicities and different ways of being of South Asian descent, as opposed to this kind of, in people's mind, it's very linked strongly to being from India or speaking Tamil. And so, for instance, when I was growing up, on my identity card, it says Ceylonese, which is also not a race, but never mind. Governments. So people would be like, oh, what's Ceylonese? Because it doesn't fit, people don't understand that being of South Asian can be many things, and also because I'm mixed race. And so there is a lot of this impermeability in people understanding what culture is. And of course, if you're trying to retrace your family histories and you're looking at family backgrounds which are more complicated, multiple languages, faiths, and community groups, then, it gets much more difficult in terms of retracing. So last point that I want to make, but perhaps the bigger one, and this kind of perhaps links to the book Singapore Biography a little, is that the history of South Asian movement to and from Singapore is of course intertwined with the fact that at the time, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the British Empire controlled much of the Indian subcontinent, right? But in Singapore today, it is not well examined or well understood at large in terms of what at large colonialism and imperialism was doing on a global level and how that plays out in Singapore. And so just talking about 3 brief examples. One example is that convict labor from British India was this labor that built many of the early roads and buildings in the first half of the 19th century. And these are buildings that are now recognized as national monuments, so they're kind of enshrined in that way. These are roads that are named after British colonial officials today still. And yet what we know about the experiences of the convict laborers are from the accounts of the British administrator who oversaw that work. And so we don't really know what the men and women, because there were women among them, thought of themselves about their work, their time in Singapore. And there is sort of an inability to access it, but also it hasn't been looked at. And another reason it hasn't been looked at is because today modern Singapore is still highly reliant on migrant labor from South Asian countries and has a well-documented history of exploiting that labor. And so, thinking about, if you start looking at what were the British doing in the 19th century, and then how are we treating migrant labor today, might throw up very uncomfortable and embarrassing truths about neocolonial attitudes in Singapore today. And so, as a subject, it's difficult to touch, right? Even if you want to, because even today there are people in power who would rather we not think too hard about us exploiting migrant labor from other countries. A second example is, oops, got my pages mixed up. Yeah, second example that comes up in Singapore, 19th century history a lot, is the presence of soldiers from British India. And they were posted to defend British possessions in Singapore. And they're kind of seen as part of the establishment. Oh, the British bought these soldiers and this is what they did. But the question of how did the soldiers feel about being shipped around the empire, being stuck in Singapore, subjected to British laws and, being part of the British Indian military, and how did they look at other people that they encountered in colonies like Singapore. And so like even just looking about like the motivations of people like that caught up in empire is like has not been, I think, to my knowledge, really looked at in great detail. And then the last example is one that is about women from World War II. One particular example that is also mentioned in my book is called the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, which was a regiment of women soldiers raised by Subhas Chandra Bose as part of the Indian National Army. And so they were funded by the Japanese, who were at that time in the Pacific, controlling India and trying to say, oh, if you fight and help us overthrow the British, we will give India independence after that. That was the promise, right? And so this Rani of Jhansi Regiment, the stories around them focus on women who were exceptional in the sense of against expectations of what women would do. They took up arms, they left their families, they trained in the jungles, they engaged in battle and so on. So they're kind of seen in that space. But again, that throws up interesting questions, like what were all the other women doing, the ones who were not taking part in this nationalist movement? And even for the ones who were involved, like sort of the more complex motivations, and I think, yeah, how that looks forward towards future nationalism, whether in India, Singapore, Malaya, like is something that is still a gap. Yeah, so on that note, I mean, the last point I guess I wanted to say is that there is also that emotional connection, which I guess is the thing that perhaps I am most curious with now as a writer. But with my grandfather, it seems like impermeable because he is gone, and limited access to what might have been on his mind. And so just to some extent thinking like, yeah, what are the questions that he might have had even about his own life that are impossible to know now, but might be possible to detect through other means. And that is probably why I'm a fiction writer. So anyway, on that note, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Gaiutra and Krystal, thank you for those beautiful readings. And Yu-Mei, thank you so much for these thoughts, reflections. I'm really grateful to have a chance to learn a little bit about your grandfather and share those stories with everyone here. I want to start our conversation at the haunting, which Krystal referred to in the section she read from her book. I'm very grateful that she did that. Is a phrase that I was incredibly struck by, and I want to reread this quote again so we can sit with it. It says, "We start at the beginning. We go back to the haunting, the cycle, to the deafening roar of silence from women echoing off the coasts of the islands. I learned that my mother and grandmother do want to tell us. All we must do is ask, then listen." And so in response to this quote, I want to ask you all to speak to the hauntings that are at the heart and at the origin of your work, looking back over generations of systemic oppression, forced migration, and more personally over generations of family history and often quite violent family history. I want to hear what is that kind of haunted heart and origin of your projects, fiction, nonfiction, any journalism. And as I ask this question to you, I realize that, factual origins, the stories that our families, communities, our governments tell about themselves are not always, in line with the facts. And so we do recognize that and invite you to speak to that too, if you're comfortable. Because I took your phrase, Krystal, I want to ask you to go first.
I think what's at the heart of my work all the time is women's voices. And I think that's so because I found it incredibly brave of my mom and my grandmother to take this journey with me and talk about things that you don't normally talk about. It's what society tells you, you don't air out your dirty laundry, which is essentially what my family told us we were doing when they started sharing stories of domestic violence and child abuse. And so people will come up to me and they'll say, "That was incredibly brave of you." And I I think the bravery really lies on their shoulders. And I remind people of that all the time, because they came forward and they were able to share their stories, not just with me, because now this book is out in the world, and I didn't change my name. So people who know me, it's very easy to figure out who my family members are. And the heartbeat really always is that, because women, specifically women in my family, were silenced for so long, I really wanted to help other women get their stories out into the world through using ourselves as this vessel. And I've said this a few times over the years, but this book, when I was able to give it to my grandmother and my mom for the first time, I told them, I said, this is a love letter to both of you, because we spent so long together telling these stories, and it took 10 years for this book to actually make its way into the world. And as for factual, so this is something that's with creative nonfiction, factual versus the creative part of it. I'm not a journalist. I think journalism is its very own distinct style. This is solidly creative nonfiction, and the focus always, while I am writing nonfiction, while I am writing about real people, it's always in service of a story. And yes, they are real people, but in service of a story, they're characters. And their entire lives, it can never be on the page. So you get a portion, and now you're getting a generational portion. So it's a third myself, a third my mom, and a third my grandmother. That's how the book is split up. And I really wanted to keep with in service of women and their voices and their stories. And because all of this is oral storytelling, it's stories that are passed on from one woman to another, one generation to another, and they're never recorded. And so, I shouldn't say never. Sometimes they are, right? In diary form, sometimes you will find them. But I'm talking about officially recording some of these stories that I've collected along the way, speaking to other women about their personal development in the wake of domestic violence, and watching their children be abused by their spouses is something that is probably at the heartbeat of a lot of my work.
Yu-Mei, I'd love to hear about the kind of original, the haunting, the heartbeat at your work, and not just Singapore biography too, any work that you have been in progress on.
Yeah, I think very briefly, with Singapore history, it was because I grew up with a certain kind of history being told that was flat and uninteresting, honestly. Not a very good story. But also, like, as you get older, and of course you realize that Singapore society is more complex. And then when I worked on the National Museum project, which led to the book Singapore Biography, that led to this all my personal revelation of, like, there are all these archival records and other kinds of stories that have been recorded, maybe aren't well-known biographies and so on, but putting them together in a broader narrative, still honoring the original voice, but, you know, showing that there are a range of voices and ideas about what it means to be Singaporean was, to me, very, like, you know, mind-opening at that time. And then I guess, like, linking it back to what I was talking about my grandfather, and I've been kind of puzzling over this, because I think my own question is, why am I not more curious about him in some ways? And I suppose part of it might be the emotional disconnect of, like, I was very young when he passed away, and so I just didn't have any, like, you know, magic moments to conjure and then to try and find out what lay behind him. But at the same time, you know, it's also a point of curiosity of, like, oh, how much is it possible to know about a person? Which, if you're writing fiction, is kind of all you think about all the time. Like, what am I putting on the page? And so this question of, like, other ways maybe to approach truth that is not about facts or things that are footnoted in history and so on. My brain is kind of very curious about that, and what other ways to get at, you know, human emotional truths. Yeah, I kind of made a leap into the deep end on that.
Gaiutra. Yeah.
There's so many resonances, between and among our work, our approaches, although the genres are different, right? So, I mean, I'm a former newspaper reporter. I worked for newspapers for 10 years, and then I embarked on this book project, which covers some of the same ground as Secrets We Kept, except that it is very hybrid. It sort of depends on which part of it you touch. Some of it is personal. Some of it is based on work with the archives, Colonial Office archives, India Office archives, and some of it is reported on the ground. So I guess there are a couple of different ways to answer that question. I'm haunted by the same things that Krystal is haunted by women's voices, silenced women's voices. I'm haunted by racialized violence, which my family experienced when we moved to the United States in the 80s. We moved to Jersey City, the Heights, at a time when there was an anti-Indian gang, which they call themselves the Dot Busters, were active and killed 2, perhaps 3 people and conducted really violent attacks against others. We landed in the middle of that. So, they spray painted Hindus Go Home on our garage door. We were spat at. My father was chased with broken bottles. And I think in a way that is the beginning of Coolie Woman. Although it's a history of indentured women, people ask me why I wrote it. I wrote it because my family reflects, there have been also many women who experienced gender-based violence, but I feel like I wasn't as brave as Krystal. My approach to it was different. It was to go into the archives to kind of deflect in a way. So there is that narrative, the story of violence against women that I'm haunted by. Identity, really, and how identity is traumatized when it encounters moments of racial violence like that. I feel like I was as driven to know as much as I could about my family's connections to India because my family was targeted as Indian, although we weren't, when we landed in Jersey City, right? So I was always curious about our connection to India, and my father told me about his grandmother, who is our closest link, and he said she was a pregnant woman traveling alone, right? So that got me very curious because I had been raised in this very conservative, sort of culturally conservative household in which everything was proper, and we only said proper things about our history. So there was this hint, this sort of whisper of something a little less than proper. And in the course of doing the work in the archives, what I discovered was that her story was more representative than any of us knew, right? But I also want to touch on something which is difficult. I'm sort of haunted between the slippages between the stories of individuals and the kind of like the grander narrative of history, right? How do those two things interact with each other? And how does it explain some of the violence that we're talking about, right? Because, the system of indenture relied upon a shortage of women, right? Which is kind of the origin story of the violence against women in the Indian Caribbean. It was because of British imperial policy that resulted in this kind of like explosive situation on the plantations where there were only 40 women for every 100 men, right? So there is that history, which of course shapes what happened to individual women and the traumas that they underwent. But, and this is the hard part, it also hugely disfigured Indo-Caribbean men, right? And I think it's important to also have sympathy, although that sounds really hard when you say it out loud, to try to sort of understand the roots of that very deep pain and patterns of behavior that have been handed down from one generation to the next. And there's so many ways in which the slippages between the larger historical narrative and what has unfolded in our own lives. I mean, we could spend all afternoon talking about that, right? But I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. And I do want to follow up on this idea. I love the term slippages because I want to talk and ask you about silences and the silences you have encountered, amidst communal and familial history, but also in the archives, museums, academic institutions you've worked within, alongside. I have a kind of overarching question for all of you and then an individual question as well. So the overarching question is whether you think any of these silences were unintentional or were they all intended? And then Gaiutra, I'd love to hear you speak a bit more about this idea of archival research versus ancestral memory. So I was really struck by the nature. It makes so much sense to me hearing you describe Coolie Woman as hybrid because there are so many questions that are left in the text, and just in the flow of it, there are so many questions that we simply cannot answer because those answers would be in documents and materials that are lost, were destroyed, simply never existed. And I'm really curious to hear how you balance that archival research alongside family memory in your creation of that book.
So when I started writing Coolie Woman, I've been listening to the New Yorker fiction podcasts, and that particular month, Salman Rushdie had read Donald Barthelme's story concerning the bodyguard. It is a very compact story, maybe 1,500 words long, written entirely in questions. There, I think, is one statement in the entire short story. So in trying to deal with some of the uncertainties and unanswered questions about my great-grandmother or so many other indentured women, I thought this could work. So, I mean, that's a deliberate device used throughout the book to kind of dramatize not only the inability to find answers, but is a little aggressive too. It's kind of dramatizing the interrogation of the archives, right? In the way that Saidiya Hartman talks about as well, kind of like revealing the violence of the archives, the violence in its silences of marginalized voices like all of our families and ancestors, right? So there were actually a lot of details about indentured women to be found in ship records and immigration official reports, captains' diaries. Coming back to the idea of slippages, even though these documents were written by white men for the most part, sometimes there would be some pretty awesome glimpses. So for instance, on one ship, there's a woman who was accosted by a sailor who grabbed her breast, right? And so the documents describe her cursing him out, and the word that she used, sala, right? So that's a slippage, right? So yes, I was interrogating the archives, kind of being cheeky with them, but also open to the places where there might be some interiority hinted at, and to grab onto that. In terms of the places where the family stories and the archives contradicted each other, I just kind of let them sit side by side. Again, like uncertainty is the mode of my book. And maybe that has something to do with my journalistic training. I kind of like to just be empirical and let the rest of you decide what to make of it. But what I found was that, family memory, oral history is as unreliable as the records, as misleading as the records, and the truth lies somewhere in between, right? So with indentured women, one narrative is that, they were all kidnapped. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to work on the plantations and essentially been turned into prostitutes, right? So they were all kidnapped, victims. Then the other narrative is that they were escaping oppression of various forms in India, right? And so in one family, you interview different members of the family and you'll find those two completely contradictory accounts of the same woman's exit. Right. So that in itself, I just let that, that's kind of interesting and compelling on its own. So I let that be what I was trying to say.
I love that. Yeah. And so Krystal, As we heard from your reading, secrets we kept grew out of conversations with the women in your family, recounted in Trinidadian Creole, as again we heard in your reading, which I really loved to encounter on the page. And I'd love to hear you speak to why it was important to keep the rhythm of that speech alive on the page in this book. You also write in the book that you acted as both witness and release for your mother, your grandmother, the women in your family. And I'd love to hear you talk to, I mean, these are really painful conversations and memories you were dredging up. How did you care for them as you were talking, and for yourself too?
I have to thank Lily for her incredibly hard questions. She really made me think a lot. So in answer to like the imposed silences, whether we knew about them or not, I think part of it is not that I wanted to silence male voices, but I wanted to mute them and amplify women's voices in this book. And how could I do that? By taking away the women speaking. So I had to include the Trinidadian Creole, because if I took it away, how am I capturing an oral story and then not putting the women in and having them speak for themselves? Then I would also be at fault for silencing them in some way. So, excuse me, I wanted to preserve. I love language. I love when literature incorporates language and all its like funky, interesting, academic ways. And so I wanted to preserve Trinidadian Creole. I really wanted to do it, but in my own way. So I looked to other authors. I loved Zadie Smith, Edwidge Dandicat, Roxane Gay, all Caribbean authors. And I'm looking to them. How did they portray language on the page from their own islands? Because all the islands are so vastly different and they have their own histories, even though we refer to them as the islands, as though they're all as one. They're not. So I remember reading Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God very early on in college. And then after I graduated with my MFA, I went back and I taught the book. I loved it. I didn't care about what anybody else said in the classroom when I was a student. Then I had to teach it, and it's a very different approach. And so the more I taught this book, and it's written in vernacular from the beginning to the very end, the more I realized that people either really, really loved this approach, like I did, or they absolutely hated it. And I wanted to kind of find some kind of compromise there. And so I thought, let me use standard English, which is the way I speak when professionally out in the world, and then let me marry that with what I use at home, so that you get to hear both. And that becomes also, I realized after the fact, this wasn't intentional, that was me on the page, because that's how I am out in the world. And so that became just a happy thing that happened. Oh my God, I'm a writer, I swear. So that was something that came out of it without me intentionally doing it. And the process to write this book, it was so long. It was very long. So I wanted to, your question on caring for people along the way is something that I had to learn the hard way. And it's my mom's recounting all these stories. My grandmother's recounting all these stories. And at one point, she's caring. My grandmother is caring for my dying grandfather as they're talking through all of these stories. And this happens over the course of 4 years before he dies. And at one point, I overhear my grandmother talking to my mom. And she says, the knife's right there. It's in the drawer. And it's tempting me, And so, oh my God, that is when I realized that's my first encounter with re-traumatization. I didn't have the language for it as we were doing it. I was really young when I started this book. I think I was 21 when I started writing this book and learning all of these stories. And it was over the course of those 10 years where I learned these terms from writing professors and from reading more about writing about trauma and what that does to the people writing about it and all the other people involved. And so I realized I need to take a step back. And that's why the book took 10 years. It's because every once in a while I needed to take a big step back for them and then just allow them to exist and allow them to be and be healthy and do different things in the process of recounting a lot of these memories. And how we did that was through cooking, which also becomes a device that I used in writing, because it was also a device I used in real life in getting them to release some of these stories.
That's beautiful. If we have time, I do really want to talk about food with everyone and cooking and that process. Yu-Mei, having heard your reflections earlier, I may actually change up the question I had a little bit, if that's okay, because I'm really curious, as a trained historian, having written, about 10 years ago now, this biography of Singapore, how are you approaching now writing fiction and writing that like unsayable thing in your work? I know that's a hard question, but I'm curious.
I don't know, because it's unsayable. Well, I think, let's see. Yeah, I was just ruminating. I mean, earlier when Lily broached the question of silences and what's there and what's not in museums and archives, and I was kind of like, what am I going to say in response? I was thinking about, for instance, in my family, so my father's side of the family with the Sri Lankan connection is very multilingual, and around the table for my dad's generation with my grandparents when both were still alive, it was common to hear Malay, English, Teochew, maybe Teochew is just like 潮州话, maybe a bit of Mandarin, but not much because Mandarin's a much later insertion, and maybe Tamil for all I know. I just as a child wouldn't have recognized it. And to speak in these polyglot languages. I grew up in a household with my parents that primarily spoke English, and I speak Mandarin, but it's not fluent, let's just say. And I think in English, and I always say I dream in English. And so I feel kind of monolingual, even though I do speak other languages. And so with my grandparents, all of them, I have always felt some distance because of just pure language. And so not so much that maybe they're not silent, maybe it's just I can't access it. And it was interesting, a few years before my grandmother, my Chinese paternal grandmother passed, she spoke, never went to school, don't know if she was actually able to read, but she could speak, enough of 5 or 6 everyday languages to get by in life. One afternoon, I'm having lunch with her, just her and me, and she starts telling me the story from World War II in broken English and Mandarin. And I'm sitting there going, oh, I really wish I had learned some of the other languages when I was younger so that I could access it. So something was coming out of her. And I was just listening because I like red alert, pay attention, don't say anything, don't spoil grandma's mood. She's on a roll. I don't know what's happening. She's 96 years old. Let her talk. Very coherent story in broken English and smattering of Mandarin and maybe a bit of Cantonese, which I understand, maybe some 潮州话. Wow. It was a very strange experience. After it, I ended up like writing a bunch of notes and then subsequently writing an essay about what was my grandma trying to say? What is it possible to hear? What can you listen to beyond the language barrier? And then the story she told me was from out of World War II, and basically it was about Japanese soldiers showing up at the door one night, and her family was terrified because she was a young woman that she might be attacked, and she was not, but they heard about attacks happening to other young women in the village or in the region. But my grandma was just telling me this over some rice and veggies in a very matter-of-fact way, and I was just like, what's going on? So yeah, I was just ruminating on that and thinking about like silences when they're broken. If someone wants to talk, I think the lesson I've learned from my anthropology classes is let them talk and try not to get in the way. And maybe to use that to leap to fiction. I have also tried to learn about my own writing. Sometimes you're trying to structure a story and you're like, I'm going to tell the story and it's going to be about this and this and this. And the character's going to go into a room and have a conversation with that and come out. And then it's like too structured and you kind of got to sit there and be like, what's going to happen next in the next sentence, like not even in the next scene, or what is my story about, but just kind of feeling your way forward. In a way you're listening to yourself or to some subconscious. But I often think about those kinds of things, like those are the very vague abstract spaces I like to mull over.
So You really made me think about something, Yu-Mei. It's that she's telling you the story, right? And it's food. That's something that I discovered along the way. There's something about breaking bread with someone. Just think about it. It just lowers your inhibitions, kind of like alcohol. But it's, not everybody drinks. But it, right? There's comfort and there's sustenance in food. And so she's telling you these really difficult stories in the same way my mother would just pour out all these difficult stories. And it was so much easier for them around food. And so that's why that became the structure of my interviews, always around food.
I am aware that we are running slightly out of time, so I'm going to open this up to the audience, and then if we have time, I will squeeze in one more question. But yeah, G has a mic. If you want to raise your hand with a question, chat with our panelists.
This question is open to any of you on the panel. I'm curious about your writing process as you're writing about your histories and your family members. And as much as you are aware of their histories and backgrounds and so forth, I'm wondering how much you rely on the process of extrapolation and in writing your stories. Because as much as you know about your family members, I'm just guessing you probably don't know everything about them. And then because sometimes they may choose to hide things from you. And then, that you probably have to wonder, oh, perhaps it's like this or perhaps it's like that. So do you rely on extrapolation to any extent when you're writing?
I can take it. Yeah. So the epigraph to my book, and this actually speaks to a question that you asked and I didn't answer, which is whether silences can be intentional. So the epigraph to Coolie Woman is from Adrian Rich's Cartographies of Silence, and it's silence can be a plan, the blueprint of a life. And what I found when I was doing research, for instance, looking at oral histories with the last living indentured women in Fiji, was that sometimes they would be asked a question and then choose not to answer it. Like they would say, "It was bad. What can I say?" and just leave it there. So in a way, you have to come to terms with your whole process, your very mission. In a way, it might be to some extent a violation, right? That our grandmothers and great-grandmothers may have chosen to leave some things unsaid. And so, but to your question about extrapolation, right, all of these silences, the chosen ones and the unchosen ones, put you in a really tough position. And for me, as a journalist, right, I can never just step into speculation. I did a few times in the book, but what I did was cue it very clearly. So there's one very experimental section of the book where I place my great-grandmother on a plantation while the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, is being read, and then I kind of allow myself to imagine what she, given all that may have happened to her, would have been thinking in this moment, right? And I recreated this scene, but it was all like, "Hello, reader, this is coming, and this is what I'm doing." Right? And for me, that research is so important. I spent years in the archives dealing with thousands and thousands of records. And that's because I feel like I need to get the authority in order to make some form of conclusion, right? To even go there, I need to have done that homework. But again, that's just the journalistic training kicking in. Yeah, and the one time I really felt like I had no authority, I wrote a short story. This is the one time I wrote fiction, was when I felt like I couldn't go there. So.
I say yes. Yes, I do. In listening to you talk, Gaiutra, I'm thinking about how I write nonfiction all the time. And I do, if I'm using extrapolation in any way, I let the reader know. There are cues in the work that says it's questions, and I approach it in this way because it's our human thought. It's we're wondering. It's our wonderings about other people. So if I'm asking questions about holes in a story that I cannot fill, that's nonfiction, that's built into the book. They come in the form of questions or wonderings or imaginings. And these are cue words that let the reader know, I don't know. And so I'm sharing with you what is going on in my head based on what I do know. And I think those are important too, because then it's 100% not journalism, right? Because these are creative licenses that I'm taking, and I am planting certain seeds because of what I think, and I'm sharing it. And that becomes in itself a little manipulative too, when it comes to telling a story. But I think you should always let the reader know this is what's going on.
Yeah, I feel like the more I did work in the archives and various other, looking at documents and books and other things, part of me loves to latch onto evidence because I'm like, this person said it, I can footnote it, and it must be true. And sometimes that can be useful also to build out a mosaic of like a range of people's responses to a historical period, an event, what they thought of this great or not so great figure, and so on. But then I think the extrapolating part, I mean, like when we make conclusions or, surmise, therefore most people felt about Lee Kuan Yew in this way, probably, maybe, footnote. It's really I suppose footnotes and all these things give us this sense of assurance, but sometimes I'm also like, but people remember differently, or people's memories are shaped over time. I've done a lot of reading on like collective memory and how that is, and of course the malleability of just everyday memory. What did y'all have for breakfast last week? Right, like whatever popped in your head, y'all, yeah. So part of me is also very suspicious creatively of memory, but also kind of allowing like, we remember the things that make us think we are who we are today, essentially, in a reductive way, which also to me is interesting. It's like, you're telling me this thing is important to your identity at this moment, whether it's about what you had for breakfast or what might have moved my grandmother to speak suddenly one afternoon, or for someone, that you interview face to face who's just like doesn't want to answer the question and so gives you a non-answer, or is like, I need to use the bathroom and leaves the room, or something like that. In a way, it's an answer perhaps to the question also.
There is so much to think on here. We have sadly come to the end of our time together. So I just want to thank Krystal, Yu-Mei, and Gaiutra so much.